Okay, I'm going to attempt to record this just because this is a pretty, going to be a pretty ambitious day. Oh no. All right, I know. You know, if it was only paramedic school back in the 80s or 90s, where your entire classroom time would be a few hundred hours and you're done. All right. All right. So we're going to talk about. Is it all right if I put these here? They're going to be in the way? No. No. Okay. We're going to go ahead and talk about urology and nephrology today. So, why is it so detailed? Because it's rather important. Nephrology is a huge deal in healthcare. As you guys have no doubt run into, you see a lot of patients with renal problems, right? You've run into a lot of patients with renal problems, renal failure, and we know that renal failure leads to a whole wide variety of issues. But to understand the different problems with the urinary system, the urinary tract, we kind of have to understand what's the physiology, the anatomy and physiology of the kidney and the functional units of the kidney, because when I start talking about the different disorders such as acute tubular necrosis or pre-renal, intrarenal, post-renal, or glomerulonephritis, these words refer to very specific areas of the functional units of the kidney. So this first part of the lecture is going to be an overview on just the anatomy, the basic anatomy and physiology of the renal system. There are some videos, hopefully you guys are able to watch them. You may or may not have found them very helpful, but at least you had some exposure to the terminology and you possibly have some sort of clue as to what may be going on. I think everybody does. I think hopefully everybody's at the intuition where blood comes in and pee comes out, okay? I'm assuming that most of us are at that point, right? Blood comes into the kidney and pee comes out, right? Okay, grade school stuff, right? Public education, word for me. So if everybody's at that point, I think there's something I can work with there, all right? If you don't know that, well, I don't. What are you doing here? I don't know. What are you doing here? No, I'm just kidding. All right, so we got it. So let's go ahead and first talk about the anatomy, and let's talk about the macroscopic anatomy of the kidney. So here you have the kidney. The kidney is not particularly large. It's a rather small organ. It's kidney bean shaped. And where is a kidney located in the human body? The retroperitoneal space, right? So it's located behind the peritoneum, behind the abdominal cavity. Or you could say, technically you could say it resides within the abdominal cavity, but toward the back. The kidneys are anchored to the aorta, okay, and the kidneys are fed by a large artery that comes off the aorta, of the abdominal aorta, known as the renal artery. You guys okay with that? So blood comes into the kidney through the renal artery, and then blood leaves the kidney through the renal vein, and then the renal vein empties into the inferior vena cava, or the inferior vena cava. So you guys are hopefully okay there with the basic circulatory aspect. We know that urine comes out of the kidney through, what's this structure here? Ureter. This is known as ureter. And it goes where? To what structure? Bladder. The bladder. The bladder is kind of a muscular bag. And when the bladder fills up, there are stretch receptors in that. Though they fire off and they let the brain know, hey, we got to empty this thing. And the brain says, hey, empty the bladder. The bladder contracts. Urine is expelled through what structure? Urethra. Through the urethra and out of the body. You guys are good with that, right? That's just the basic anatomy. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take the kidney, and I'm going to slice the kidney in half, and we're going to take a look at the basic macroscopic structure of the kidney. So this very outer part is a lining, okay, just like most organs have some sort of outer lining, and this is known as the renal capsule. All right, the renal capsule. It's just a really thin kind of layer that kind of holds the kidney together. And occasionally you can have like trauma, and I don't know if you guys have ever heard of the term a subcapsular hematoma. Has anyone ever heard that? It's not an uncommon problem with blunt trauma of the kidneys where you can get a little hematoma or a collection of blood underneath the renal capsule. That's generally not a huge problem. It's generally a fairly minor issue if you get that and go away. Okay, so just like the brain, there is an outer part of the kidney known as the cortex, okay, the renal cortex. So where would the renal cortex be in this? Huh?
Probably need outside.
Yeah, so the renal cortex would be here. And I always get these confused because I always think of cortex as being in the core, but that's not the case. And then you have what's known as the renal medulla, which is deeper in, okay? And the renal medulla are these little parts here, these little lined parts. And these little line parts make up a wedge-shaped structure. And I'm just going to put a box around one of these, known as the renal pyramids. All right, and what's this structure right in here known as? The calyx. Yeah, the large area where all of these minor calyxes come in is known as the major calyx. And then you have all these little minor guys. You guys okay with that?
Yeah.
All right, that's really your basic anatomy of the kidney, and of course the ureter here. All right, you guys good with that? So, I'm going to ask you a question. What is the functional? So we know the kidney has a whole bunch of stuff going on, but what is the functional unit of the kidney known as?
Nephron.
You guys good with that? The nephron? Now, is the nephron a cell?
No.
What is the nephron?
Functional unit.
How about that? Thank you, Dr. Gonzalez.
Public education. Dr.
The nephron is a collection of tissues and cells, okay, working together. So do not look at the nephron as a single cell. Okay, it's not a cell. It's actually many different types of cells and tissues, ultimately, working together to form this functional unit. You guys okay with that? So the nephrons start in the medulla, or in the cortex rather, and parts of the nephron penetrate down into the cortex and make up the cortex. So some of the nephron exists within the cortex, and some of the nephron exists into the medulla. You guys okay with that? And we'll talk about what goes where. So the functional unit of the kidney is the nephron. You have about maybe 1.5 million nephrons per kidney. Okay, and they're pretty resilient little buggers. And you can lose around half of your nephrons and still have pretty normal renal function. You'll measure your BUN, your creatinine, and you'll have pretty normal labs. So your kidneys can take a hit and they'll keep working, and that's a good thing. We just see right after about the age of 30 or 35, we actually see just a gradual normal decline in renal function. So yeah, once you get into your mid-30s, it's all over. Things start going away, and that's just the way it is. Now we know that there are conditions that can accelerate that destruction of the nephrons. Hypertension is a huge one, right? We know that hypertension, particularly unrecognized or untreated hypertension, is a big one. We also know diabetes, particularly diabetes that is not well managed, is another huge. And what are the two common causes of renal failure around here?
Hypertension and diabetes.
Hypertension and diabetes, yeah, all day long. So there's a very, very close connection between chronic renal failure, hypertension, and diabetes. Those things tend to go together. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is this diagram over here. I'm going to zoom in to one slice of this, one area of this kidney. I'm going to zoom in, I'm going to look at one single nephron, okay? I'm going to look at one single nephron, and we're going to look at the basics of how that nephron works. So I have this little area here, and imagine I've taken that and I've enlarged it to here, okay? You guys okay with that? Mm-hmm. So this is just one nephron here. And this is a model. This is idealized. It's not this clean or this concise in real life. But we're going to use this as our model for understanding what goes on in the nephron. Okay, so I have the renal artery, and the renal artery branches out into arterioles. You guys okay with that? And those arterioles eventually branch out into little arterioles here. And that's where we're going to start this journey through the nephron, if you will. All right? So I have a little arteriole that comes into the nephron. And what is the name of that arteriole that comes into the nephron? Good. So it comes from, so if it's coming into the nephron, it's coming into something, we call it afferent, right? Just like the brain, we talked about afferent, efferent pathways. So this is known as the afferent, and I plan to leave this up for you guys too, okay? I won't erase it. This is called the afferent arteriole. All right, so blood is coming in to the nephron from the afferent arteriole, and then blood leaves the nephron. What do you suppose this is right here? Efferent. The efferent arteriole. So I'll fill that in. All right, you guys cool with that so far? Now, there is a network of capillaries inside of this bulbous structure here. We'll talk about what this is, but there's this network of capillaries in here, and this little network of capillaries is known as the what? The glomerulus. Are you guys okay with that? And let me just look it up, make sure I don't misspell it. So I'll just draw a little arrow here. Glomerulus. Glomerulus. You guys cool with that? All right, so there's the glomerulus. The glomerulus is contained within this capsule-like structure known as the Bowman's capsule. Bowman's capsule. Boy, it's not, those videos actually were somewhat helpful, huh?
Yes.
Yeah, all right. So, what is the major thing that happens within the Bowman's capsule?
Filtration.
Okay, cool. So there are 4 major processes occurring within the nephron. The first major process is filtration, and I have these color-coded for those of you that can see color. Sorry. I pick on David a lot, so it's, you know, I got to spread the love a little bit. Yeah, kidney shot. So, do you see this arrow here?
Yes.
This arrow is kind of a brown color, and it is representing filtration. So filtration is the movement, okay, of stuff from the glomerulus into the Bowman's capsule. Okay, you guys good with that? Into the Bowman's capsule. So really the only place we see filtration is within the Bowman's capsule. You guys cool with that? Yeah. And what happens is there are specialized structures in the glomerulus, cells, that allow certain substances to pass through these capillaries into the glomerulus. We're not going to talk about all the specific cells that exist in here, but they exist and they help facilitate the movement. So what are some of the major things that move from the blood into the Bowman's capsule? Sodium is a huge one. Sodium ions, potassium ions, chloride ions. Pretty much chloride goes wherever sodium goes. What else? Bicarbonate ions,
H2O,
water, right? And just remember this, in the kidney, wherever sodium goes, water follows, okay? Wherever sodium goes, water follows. Water follows sodium. That is an important principle of the kidneys. It is an important principle for how many of the diuretics that we can administer work. They work by altering where sodium goes. And if I can alter where sodium goes, then that's going to cause a gradient, right? An osmotic gradient that will shift water in and out. You guys cool with that? Mm-hmm. All right, cool. So I'm going to have water, sodium, chloride, potassium. I'm going to have urea, some urea molecules. I'm going to have creatinine, bicarbonate. We know that urea and creatinine are kind of waste products, right? We like to get rid of those. And am I going to have anything large getting into the Bowman's capsule?
Shouldn't.
No. Under normal circumstances, large molecules are not filtered in the glomerulus. Are you guys okay with that? So large proteins in the blood, things like albumin, things like red blood cells, for example, tend not to go through the glomerulus, okay? Those pores that they go through, they're not big enough. You guys cool with that? Okay with that? That makes sense? Now, can we actually find blood in the blood cells in the urine?
Yeah.
Is that a normal thing though?
No.
So when we see blood in somebody's urine, that is an abnormal finding, and that means somehow this mechanism has failed. Either I have an injury somewhere, and blood cells have entered through an injury, or like with hypertension, I can have such a high pressure that I have little micro fractures inside of the glomerulus, and red blood cells are basically pushed through those little fractures, which is a bad thing as well, right? Having too high of a pressure. So you guys okay with that? That makes sense? So I'm going to throw some numbers at you just to kind of help you understand kind of what's going on. So we make about 180 liters of filtrate per day. Okay, so we produce about 180 liters of this stuff per day. 180 liters per day. It's pretty significant if you think about it. Let's break that down to per minute, if we will. That is about 125 milliliters per minute, give or take. It's approximately 125 milliliters per minute of filtrate. You guys okay with that? Now, what I want to do is I want to contrast that with how much urine we normally produce per day. What's the normal amount of urine in an adult? 1 to 2 liters. Okay, so I'm producing 180 liters per day of filtrate, and I'm producing down here 1 to 2 liters per day of urine. Holy crap.
We are really concentrating that down.
Yeah, okay. So we're only excreting, which is the second major process that happens, is excretion. We're only excreting, what, about 1 to 2%, you know, more or less, maybe a little less. About 1% of what actually gets filtered. Are you guys okay with that? So what do you suppose is happening with this filtrate as it goes through the nephron? Most of that filtrate is actually getting reabsorbed, right? 99% of it gets reabsorbed back into the blood. Are you guys cool with that? Now, there is a special word that means that stuff in the filtrate gets reabsorbed back into the blood, and that special word is reabsorption. You guys got it. So reabsorption can be seen as filtrate moving back into the blood. So reabsorption is recycling stuff, if you will. Okay, it's stuff coming back into the body. So is reabsorption associated with elimination? If I reabsorb something, do I eliminate it?
No.
No, that's a big thing to know. Stuff that gets reabsorbed does not get eliminated, does not get excreted. Are you guys cool with that? Okay. All right. So let's now kind of take this journey through the nephron. So I have a glomerulus. In the Bowman's capsule, we have filtration occurring through the glomerulus, and I have this filtrate. This filtrate is then going to move through the nephron. And I have this first part of the nephron that comes out of the Bowman's capsule that is near. So this is known as the proximal what?
Convoluted.
What does convoluted mean? Twisty. Twisty, yeah. Twisty. A lot twistier than I drew on the board, but there are a couple of twists here. So this is known as the proximal convoluted tubule. Now, the way that this works is I have reabsorption occurring all along the tubule, okay? And certain things are reabsorbed in certain areas. You guys cool with that? So, let's talk about what gets reabsorbed with the proximal convoluted tubule, okay? So what are the major things that get reabsorbed here? Sodium and, chloride. Well, yeah, chloride. I'm not even really going to talk much about chloride because it just follows sodium. So I kind of look at those as going together. But sodium.
Bicarb. Sodium, potassium.
Yeah, bicarb. What else though? What always follows sodium? Water. Okay. Actually, a majority of the sodium in the water in the human body is reabsorbed right here. Okay. A majority of it is reabsorbed at the proximal convoluted or proximal collecting tubule. Approximately 65 to 70% of all the sodium is reabsorbed here. All right. So 65 to 70% of our sodium and about 65% of our water. You guys cool with that? So I have a whole bunch of reabsorption occurring here. And reabsorption means to move from the tubule back into the blood. You guys cool with that? From the tubule back into the blood. Now there is one last process that occurs that we haven't talked about, and that is the process of secretion. Secretion is a movement of stuff from the blood into the tubules. So is secretion associated with excretion, or is it associated with reabsorption? Secretion is
Reabsorption.
Is it reabsorption?
No, excretion.
So secretion, where is the movement occurring with secretion?
Into the tubules.
From the blood to the tubule. And if we're moving stuff into the tubule, that is promoting the excretion of it as urine, in the urine. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm moving stuff into the tubule, I'm getting rid of it. If I'm moving stuff out of the tubule, I'm holding on to it. So a major area of secretion in the nephron is in this proximal convoluted tubule. And there are two major things that are secreted here. Ammonia is one of them, NH3. Ammonia and a lot of our drugs. This is where a lot of our drugs or a lot of our drug metabolites are secreted. Okay, you guys cool with that? All right, so what is left over after reabsorption makes it here. And do you see this line right here, this straight line? You guys see that okay? This straight line designates or delineates the renal cortex from the renal medulla. So all of this stuff right up here, okay, all this stuff here is where? In the renal cortex. That's here, right, in this part of the... So the glomerulus, the Bowman's capsule, the proximal tubule all exists here. And then what happens is the proximal tubule converts into another structure that penetrates down into the renal medulla. And this structure here is collectively known as the loop of Henle. Okay? This entire structure we'll call the loop of Henle. So I will draw that down here. Loop of Henle. Now the loop of Henle is divided into two branches, if you will. Okay? What's the first part of the loop of Henle here?
Descending.
This is the descending what?
Limb.
The limb. The descending limb. The descending limb. I'll just draw a line to it. And then this part here is the ascending limb. All right, you guys cool with that? So far? Okay, so what happens here is a really interesting process known as countercurrent multiplication. Holy cow, what a word that is. A process known as countercurrent multiplication occurs here. And I'm going to describe what that is. It's actually fairly simple, what's going on. It's just a complicated word for something simple. So, what happens is, the ascending limb that moves up, the ascending limb does not allow water to flow through it. It is impermeable to water, but sodium can move out. So I can have reabsorption of sodium. You guys cool with that? So what happens is, only sodium can move out here. So sodium moves out, and so the area here, the renal medulla, is very salty. Okay, this area of a kidney is very salty. There's lots of sodium. You guys cool with that? So I have a very large collection of sodium here, if you want to look at it like that, where I have lots of sodium here. Okay, because the only thing that can leave the ascending limb is sodium. So I have a nice stockpile of sodium. That's what happens at the ascending limb. Now, what happens at the descending limb is the only thing that can pass through the descending limb is water. So what do you suppose is going to happen as the filtrate passes through the descending limb?
Push the water out.
There you go. The water is going to want to do what?
Follow.
It's going to follow all that sodium. That's what we mean by countercurrent multiplication. Is I have all this sodium, and this creates kind of a current, kind of a pressure, if you will, that's going to pull that water out of the descending limb. You guys cool with that?
Which is going where? It's in that
The water?
Yeah.
So it's ultimately getting reabsorbed
Okay.
back into the blood vessels. So you see how I've drawn this vessel all around the nephron? This vessel is known, it's actually many different vessels that wrap themselves all around, but I just simplified it. These are actually known as the around, right, tubular capillaries. Yeah, I just oversimplified it. So ultimately, this is a mechanism to further concentrate that filtrate. Because remember, 65% of my water and 65 to 70% of my sodium has already been reabsorbed at this point, right? So this is a mechanism to help me reabsorb even more water and more sodium. You guys cool with that? All right? So far so good? So now the water, or the filtrate, okay, is even more concentrated, okay? It's really concentrated here, and then it dilutes out a little bit here as the sodium leaves. The filtrate is going to come back up, and do you see how this kind of gets close to the Bowman's capsule here?
Yes.
Do you see that there? What's that?
Where it kisses it.
Yeah, it almost gives it a little kiss, huh? So what happens is the ascending limb becomes thick. So do you see how it's thin here? It thickens up, and it becomes, what is this tubule here that's away from the Bowman's capsule? This is the distal what?
Convoluted.
Distal convoluted tubule. All right. So right here, as the ascending limb thickens up and begins to transition into the distal convoluted collecting tubule, something rather interesting happens. And I'm going to focus on that interesting thing here in just a minute, but not yet. But and you see these little blue circles here? These blue circles are these blue circles right here. These are called macula densa cells, okay? And so what I've done is I've taken this little area here and I've enlarged it over here. I'm going to come back to this picture here though, okay? I'm gonna come back to that. This picture here is this little area here enlarged. You guys cool with that? I'm not gonna talk about right now, but I will come back to it. All right, you guys cool with that? So now that filtrate is gonna move through the distal convoluted tubule, and I have yet more reabsorption occurring. And what is being reabsorbed within the distal convoluted collecting tubule?
More sodium, more potassium.
More sodium, a little bit of potassium, and because I have more sodium, I have more water. Okay, I have about 5%. 5% of my sodium is reabsorbed here, and I have water reabsorption. Okay, a little bit of potassium as well. I also have potassium down here as well in the loop. I just didn't mention it, but there's potassium reabsorption down here too. All right, you guys cool with that? So far so good?
Yes.
So what's gonna happen now, actually let's not go on quite yet. Now, this area of the distal convoluted tubule can actually be altered. There are things that can alter this. Because I haven't really talked about what alters the permeability here, right? I just basically said most, 65 to 70% of your water, your sodium, and 65% of your water is reabsorbed here. But I didn't really say if anything acted upon this, right?
Right.
And not really. Okay, so for the majority of your reabsorption, it's going to occur. All right, but here in my distal tubule, think of this as fine tuning. All right, I'm going to have some fine tuning of that 5% of sodium that's left over. I'm going to have some fine tuning. I can either hold on to that sodium, reabsorb it, or I can allow that sodium to be excreted. I can just let it go. Does that make sense? If I hold on to the sodium, what am I going to do to water? I'm going to hold on to water. If I let go of the sodium and the sodium passes into the collecting duct here, then
Same thing with it.
so if I was dehydrated, would I want to hold on or let it go?
Hold on.
I would want to hold on to it here. Okay? There is a hormone that acts upon the distal convoluted collecting tubule. Aldosterone. Yeah. Aldosterone. So I'm going to write aldosterone right here. All right. Aldosterone acts upon the distal convoluted collecting tubule. So if there's a lot of aldosterone, what is that going to do to the reabsorption?
It's gonna hold it.
It's going to
Boost the reabsorption of sodium.
It's going to cause us to reabsorb, right? More, because remember, renin-angiotensin-aldosterone. Aldosterone causes us to hold on to sodium, which causes us to hold on to water. And when I mean hold on to, I mean it needs to go back into the blood. So aldosterone causes more reabsorption of sodium and water within the proximal convoluted, or the distal convoluted collecting tubule. Well, that's obnoxious.
By making it more permeable, or by actually?
That didn't help.
Yeah, it didn't help. It actually acts on transporters, actual channels, sodium channels. So it's actually an active transport process that can occur there. Yeah. And we won't actually talk about how those channels work or anything like that. We won't go into that detail. So you guys okay? That's where aldosterone. Remember when we talked about renin-angiotensin-aldosterone? We just said that aldosterone causes us to hold on. This is actually exactly where it works, in the distal convoluted tubule. Now, if I'm overhydrated and I need to get rid of water, I'm going to have a low level of aldosterone, and that is going to what? That is going to prevent reabsorption, and that is going to allow more water and sodium to leave in the filtrate. Does that make sense? Now that filtrate is going to dump into this little guy here, which is known as the what? This structure here, that filtrate. Huh? The collecting duct. Are you guys okay with that? The collecting duct or the collecting tubule? The collecting duct. And the collecting duct moves down this way, right? The urine moves down. And so we are in the medulla, and what is at the very end of the medulla here? My calyx, my minor calyx right here, right? Each medulla ends in a minor calyx. So these little collecting ducts, and see these little branches that I drew here? Each branch is a nephron, is a distal convoluted collecting tubule dumping filtrate into the collecting duct. Does that make sense? And then those collecting ducts are going to dump once they penetrate all the way down through the medulla, they will dump that filtrate into a minor calyx, and then the minor calyces dump the urine into the major calyx, and then that becomes the ureter. You guys cool? Excuse me. So far, so good? Is this kind of making sense? Not so bad, is it? Sort of? Okay. All right. Now, there is one more place where we get yet more reabsorption, and think of this as ultra fine tuning, okay? Ultra fine tuning. So I had my fine tuning occur in the distal convoluted tubule, and I'm going to have ultra fine tuning occurring within the collecting duct itself. And what is the other hormone, the other major hormone involved in
ADH?
Antidiuretic hormone. Yes. ADH works here in the collecting duct. High levels of ADH cause me to what? Cause me to what?
Reabsorb.
Cause me to reabsorb. High levels of ADH increase reabsorption of sodium and water here. Low levels of ADH cause me to what? Right? Causes me to excrete sodium and water. Okay? Prevents reabsorption. Does that make sense? Sir?
Is the 5% on the distal convoluted tubule and then right here where ADH, is that a max or is that a normal and then it'll go up as aldosterone or ADH max on it?
I'm not quite.
5%?
Yeah. So, yeah, if, best case scenario, you could reabsorb up to 5% of the total.
Okay, so,
Yeah.
all right.
So, yeah, aldosterone is only messing around with 5% of your sodium, and then, of course, water follows the sodium. It's even less here with antidiuretic hormone. So, when we talk about all of these things, and I'll put percentages too, what the heck. That's approximately 1 to 2%. So when we talk about hormones that regulate our water balance, we're talking about 7% of our total sodium reabsorption, right? So most of the sodium reabsorption has already occurred, and we're not really using hormones to alter this so much. It's the fine tuning, where the fine tuning is where the hormones become important. Does that make sense? So I have all my fine tuning here, and I kind of have my gross, reabsorption here. You guys cool with that? Yep. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. That's as detailed as I'm going to get here. Well, with the exception of this little guy here, but we'll get there. We'll get there. But are you guys okay with basically what's going on? So basically what's going on is blood comes in, it's filtered, and then that filtrate gets reabsorbed at different points, right? The filtrate gets reabsorbed at different points. And if I want to keep more water in the body, I reabsorb more sodium, more water. If I want to get rid of more water, I don't reabsorb it. Yes, sir.
Just to make sure you're reabsorbing into the peritubular capillaries.
So I'm reabsorbing into the peritubular capillaries, and eventually the peritubular capillaries dump into the renal vein. and then the renal vein dumps blood out into the vena cava. Does that make sense? Sir?
Just tell me, are you gonna get into the whole loop sparing, non-loop sparing?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Before I ask that question?
Yes. Before I get into the pharmacology, I want to make sure you guys know know kind of what the hell's going on with it. But does that make sense there? Okay, what's going on? Okay.
Chris, every time you're pulling out, in theory, God damn it. Every time that fluid is being removed from the filtrate tube, what do you want to call
The tubule.
it? The tubule.
Uh-huh.
Every time it's being removed from there, it's going back into the vasculature, the blood vasculature.
Yes.
So it's wrapped around thousands of billions of times.
Oh yeah, I mean it's just like, this is so super simplified, but it literally, the capillaries are just
like
lining all this.
All right.
What's that?
Alveoli, they're just.
Yeah, like the alveoli, it's just kind of lining it all over the place. Does that kind of answer?
Yeah.
I just totally super simplified it here. But you can imagine that it's just wrapped all around here. If that makes sense. Okay, you guys good so far? Now, does the kidney have the ability to release hormones?
Yes.
Yeah, there are two hormones it releases. What are they? Renin and renin, and it has something to do with red blood cell production. Erythropoietin. Okay.
Wow, man.
Woo! Ooh.
Careful, doctor.
Yeah.
What are the two letters?
Yeah. Yeah, there you go. PA, you have, no, you're a nurse practitioner. I'm just kidding.
Just like that. Just like that.
God, this video is going to go up and I'm going to get so much. All right. So you guys, so we're good so far? More or less? Okay, cool. So what I want to do now is I want to talk about how the kidneys release renin. What causes the kidneys to release renin in the first place, right? Because remember, the kidneys release renin because they are somehow, and when I explained it to you guys, I just did some hand waving, right? I went, abracadabra, the kidneys release renin, right? That's kind of what happened. I don't like magic very much, so let's take the hand waving away and let's kind of look at what's really going on there, okay? What causes the kidneys to release renin? Remember, renin starts the entire aldosterone-angiotensin cascade, right? So renin causes angiotensin 1 to be released. Angiotensin 1 is converted by the ACE enzyme, angiotensin converting enzyme in the lungs. Angiotensin 2 causes vasoconstriction, and it also causes the release of aldosterone, and we now know where aldosterone works, right? So renin is pretty important, right? It causes vessels to constrict, to bump that blood pressure up, and it causes aldosterone to be released, which causes us to hold on to sodium and water, right? It causes us to reabsorb. So it's kind of nice to know what's going on. So remember where that had that little kiss there? So we're going to look at that little kiss right here.
Well, what causes the RAS to start?
That's what we're going to do.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's a question.
I thought you were just skipping over. I was like,
No, that's the question that we're fixing to answer. I was just kind of building it up, right? Because in America, we build everything up. So we're going to look at this little kiss here. And so what I've done is, imagine that you're looking at the vessel straight on. Okay, imagine that the vessel's popping out of the board, and I'm looking at it straight on, and I cut it. You guys cool with that? So what I've done is I've taken that, and I've put it right here in front of you. So this is the inside of that distal tubule. That's the lumen of this guy here. You guys cool with that? And then what I have is I have the afferent arterial here. So that's this structure right here, afferent. So blood is moving in. You guys cool with that? Blood is moving in. The glomerulus would be right here. And then blood is moving out this way efferent. Okay, so I have this structure right here occurring. You guys cool with that? Does that kind of make sense with what's going on here?
Yes.
Okay, so this is where that magic happens, right? A little hand wave. All right, so we have renin release. And renin is released, and there are 3 different things that cause renin to be released, okay? Renin is actually stored in very special cells, okay? These are known as the juxtaglomerular cells. And do you see these little green guys with the dots inside of them? Those are the juxtaglomerular cells. All right?
And that's where renin's stored?
Yeah. So renin is stored within the juxtaglomerular cells, and this whole structure here is known as the juxtaglomerular apparatus or apparatus. The juxtaglomerular apparatus or apparatus. Okay? Are you guys cool with that so far? So there are 3 things that cause these cells to secrete renin. Okay? The first thing is if the pressure inside of the afferent, okay, so the pressure coming from the renal artery, if it isn't being stretched enough and the pressure is low, okay, so a low blood pressure will cause these cells to degranulate and to release their renin, okay? And then the renin gets released and it leaves through the efferent vessel and it gets circulated through the nephron and ultimately goes to the renal vein, and then it gets circulated to the body and eventually up to the brain where it stimulates the release of other hormones. You guys cool with that? That's the first thing that causes these juxtaglomerular cells to release renin. The second thing that can cause them to release renin is, I don't want to guess.
Low flow rate or low filtration rate?
No, because is there any filtration occurring here? Well, yeah, you're right, there is filtration. Here in the glomerulus, but we assume that if it detects low blood pressure, that filtration is going to be low. So that's just kind of redundant. Huh?
pH.
Yeah, pH maybe, but does pH necessarily mean that I need to hold on to water?
So, a low volume leaving?
No, because we can assume that if there's a low volume, low pressure coming in, right, that there's going to be some sort of volume problem.
Sodium concentration.
What about the sympathetic nervous system? If I had a sympathetic response, what does my sympathetic nervous system do? What is the role of the sympathetic nervous system? What's that? Yeah, not to get real juicy. That's a parasympathetic. Fight or flight, right? So if I'm, climbing the cave bear, right? I'm climbing the cave bear, and I'm, beating coyotes and tigers down, and a bear jumps out of the cave to kill me. I need to fight that dang thing off, right? A big bear, right? And I know that bear is probably going to swipe at me. It's probably going to cause some blood loss, right? I'm going to lose some fluid fighting it and exerting myself. So that sympathetic response doesn't make sense. That part of the sympathetic response would be to tell your body to hold on to as much fluid as possible, right? Because I know that I'm going to lose it through, sweating to cool myself off. I'm going to lose it through just metabolic processes. I might lose it through blood, right? I might bleed. So the sympathetic nervous system can dump norepinephrine, okay, onto the juxtaglomerular cells and cause them to release renin. Okay, so the sympathetic response.
You said it dumps epinephrine or norepinephrine?
Norepinephrine, right?
North?
No, epinephrine will do it as well, because epinephrine and norepinephrine are so similar, but norepinephrine is the primary neurotransmitter of the sympathetic nervous system. And then finally, there are cells within the tubule itself. And what these cells do is these are chemoreceptors. They sense the chemical environment of the filtrate. So what happens is the filtrate has gone through the proximal convoluted tubule, and the filtrate has gone through the loop of Henle. You guys cool with that? And so what these cells do is they sense these macula densa cells, or chemoreceptors, and they sense the sodium level of the filtrate as that filtrate is coming through this area here. You guys cool with that? They sense the sodium level of that filtrate. And if they sense that the sodium is lower than it should be, is lower than normal, okay? If they sense that there's a lower than normal sodium, that might mean that I'm dehydrated, right? There's not as much sodium as you normally have there. That means that I've had to reabsorb more sodium. And what they will do is, these macula densa cells, see how they have little granules inside of them? They contain prostaglandins. Okay, a very specific type of prostaglandin. And when they sense low sodium, they will release the prostaglandins. And then the prostaglandins are hormones at this point, and the prostaglandins will then move across this little space here and act upon the juxtaglomerular cells and cause the juxtaglomerular cells to degranulate. And they will release. They will release the renin, and then the renin will get circulated through around the nephron, out of the kidney, and go up to the brain. So the last thing that we see are the macula densa cells. The macula densa cells. These are obnoxious. Sir?
Just an offset question. How long does it take for the renin-angiotensin cycle to work? If it senses that it's low at that third point, and there's already aldosterone, are we going to keep losing or keep reabsorbing?
Yeah, so what's going to happen is, let's assume that you become acutely dehydrated, right? So I went out on a run, or I'm out in the desert, I've lost a lot of fluid. Let's say that, and this is just a thought experiment to help demonstrate how this works. Let's say that I started in a hydrated status. I'm fully hydrated, I'm good to go. What are my levels of aldosterone going to be? Low. They're going to be low, right? I'm fully hydrated, so I don't need to reabsorb as much sodium and water. You guys cool with that? So then I start running, and I start losing a lot of fluid. So what's going to happen is, as I start to run, okay, my aldosterone levels are low, right? So I am going to have just normal reabsorption. And then as I start to lose sodium and water, as I sweat, right? The sodium levels are going to begin to get lower, all right? And what's going to happen? The macula densa cells are going to sense that sodium loss as I'm sweating, right? And because if I'm losing sodium, then the implication is that I'm losing water along with that sodium. And so the macula densa cells will degranulate. They'll cause the juxtaglomerular cells to release renin, and then that renin, okay, gets circulated to the renal vein, goes to the brain, it causes a release of angiotensin. Then angiotensin has to go to the lung, get converted to angiotensin 2, and then that causes a release of aldosterone, and then finally the aldosterone levels start going up. So I think the answer to your question is there is a delay. It is not an instant thing. There's actually, and there can actually be a significant delay if you think about it. It takes some time for that mechanism to kick in, and it's always catching up a little bit, right? Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
So the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism, there is a little delay. Now the antidiuretic hormone, the ADH, is actually here directly regulated in the brain by chemoreceptors in the brain. So my intuition, I don't know this for sure, but my intuition would be that the antidiuretic system would probably would maybe kick in a little faster than the aldosterone. That would be my guess, just based on what we know. But does that kind of answer that there is a delay?
Yeah.
You guys cool with that? Holy crap. That there is the basic anatomy and physiology of the kidney. I'm going to get you guys on a break. When we come back, we'll talk about where diuretics work on these various systems. You guys cool with that?